Some big buffs are in store for the Hammer of the Emperor, and it looks like tanks are back on the table. Let's talk about the changes to the Astra Militarum. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Imperial Guard, and in this video I thought we'd do a quick roundup of the major changes from the balanced data slate, what went up and down and by how much, and which things got passed over. So far in 10th edition, the Astra Militarum have been struggling a bit more than most of the other factions in Warhammer 40k. They did get hit by some fairly heavy artillery nerfs right from the very start of the edition when Games Workshop realised just how much fun toys they'd given them in the artillery department. But even since then, quite a lot of competitive guard lists do seem to still be converging on spamming a bunch of artillery, perhaps backed up by a bunch of sentinels in the midfield, Lord Solar for some command points, and maybe some Dawns or Deathcore of Krieg infantry to hold the midfield. With an average wins of 42% at grand tournaments, they are definitely on the lower end of the 40k power spectrum, though not quite as on the bottom of the pile compared with some of the other armies that were out there. For the first big balanced data slate for 10th edition, it's basically been entirely points focused for the Imperial Guard. Mostly as you'd expect for an army on the lower end of the power scale, there have been generally buffs to the faction, though there have been a few choice nerfs, and one or two of them do hurt quite hard. In this one, let's go through each section of the index in turn and talk about what's changed and what's not, and the units that have received the best buffs. First up though, here's just a few thoughts on how the core rules changes affect the Imperial Guard. Mortal wounds and devastating wounds maybe aren't the most relevant to them, though the free stratagem option is kind of relevant for Ursula Creed. She can give a free stratagem to a nearby regimental infantry unit, and now her options are going to be really quite limited now they're only locked to battle tactic stratagems and basically nothing else. Usually I guess that's going to mean out of the guard stratagems it's just fields of fire. The rest of them aren't battle tactic stratagems, but at least that one's quite a good one as it allows you to basically shoot an enemy unit, then the rest of your forces will be able to hit it with an extra pip of AP if you focus fire. Normally it's 2 CP, so it's quite nice to have it free, and I suppose in the enemy turn she could order units to go to ground. The benefit of cover and a 6+ invulnerable save isn't awful on infantry I suppose. Otherwise, for guard specific stuff, the changes to Overwatch are the other big thing really. You're not going to be able to overwatch with artillery within 24 inches if the artillery can't see the enemy anymore. It wasn't always the best idea for raw damage output, but occasionally just a random shot at getting a little bit of damage on a unit could be absolutely crucial, so that is one option that's gone away. Baneblades also can't fire Overwatch either anymore. That is a bit of a nerf for them, even if a lot of the points cost did go down a bit. They are big rolling fortresses absolutely covered in guns, and could get a lot of value out of a 1 command point Overwatch, particularly if you had heavy flamers on them. Overall though, I'd say that's nothing that's absolutely crucial. Ursula Creed's still going to be good for handing out fields of fire, and I guess for those niche cases you'd be spending the CP on something else. Getting into points changes though, and we'll start off with the infantry units. I do quite like what Games Workshop's done with the basic infantry squads. Previously they all cost the same at 65 points, now the Katachan squad's the cheapest at 55, the standard infantry and the Cadians are both 60, and the Deathcore of Krieg are 65. Overall I feel like that's really quite a good job of balancing them internally between each other. The Katachans were the worst even with scouts, just due to having heavy flamers and not particularly exciting special rules. At 55 points though, getting to move into the midfield isn't the worst. The standard infantry squad isn't too bad for holding down backfield objectives with its heavy weapon and cover, and Acadian shock troops do get their sticky objectives, which definitely isn't nothing. I think it's quite nice they're a little bit cheaper than the Deathcore of Krieg without having to nerf the Krieg for it. I think the choice is quite a lot more interesting now, though the Krieg definitely have their own advantages with special weapons and healing models and access to the Deathcore Marshal. Otherwise, Scions are down to 55 points from 60, a good boost there, so that's objective grabbing and special weapons but cheaper. I feel like a couple of units is really quite a good choice for doing secondaries quite easily, or some pinpoint strikes if you need them against something important. And then their counterparts from Cadia, the Kazakin, they're down to 100 points from 120, really quite a big drop that one. I did think they were a bit on the overcosted side before, so that's quite nice to see that change. Along with Chimeras going down, I feel like 10 of these in a Chimera is really quite a cool unit now. The Auxilia also had significant drops, Borgrins down to 80 points from 90, and Ogrins down to 65 from 75. I think that puts both of those from the pretty underwhelming to potentially really quite interesting sort of area of the Guard Codex. Probably still not standout great, but they're looking a lot better for their damage and defense overall. If you can deliver Ogrins into shooting range with those great big Ripper guns, they do a fair bit of damage. Ratlings are down to 60 points if you do want a fairly fragile unit to start in the midfield with some move shoot move sniper shenanigans, and Rough Riders are down to 70 points from 80, though I'm not sure that's quite at the place where they're still all that exciting for me. At the top of the wish list for Imperial Guard points changes were changes to battle tanks, I think. Out of the elements of the Guard army, they really did feel like the bit that were letting the side down a bit. The battle tanks in theory should be the best damage dealers and outcompeting the artillery for that. It kind of makes sense as the things that are supposed to be giving and taking blows with the enemy, rather than paying a premium for firing at things out of line of sight. Overall, it's pretty excellent news across the board for them. The Rogue Dawn's down to 260 points from 285. It was one of the better Guard units already, so a solid 10% points cut is definitely going to help it out. The Lehman Russ variants generally went down either 15 or 20 points for the most part. The Vanquisher got an extra big jump, going down from 190 to 155. It is still really quite a big hit or miss gun though, potentially enormous if it gets the right target and it rolls well, but potentially might do nothing a lot of the time. I still think that out of the Ross variants, with most of them going down more or less equally, my favourites are still probably the Exterminator and Demolisher. The Exterminator's got a nice generalist damage output and it hands out the extra AP, and the Demolisher's just generally scary against basically everything. The Tank Commander's down to just 205 points for 240. I feel like that's way better and a lot more where it needs to be. I think genuinely people will probably start taking these now in competitive lists. If you just want to spam out orders, you absolutely still can take Lord Solar, and I suspect that lots of people will. But seeing as he's now only 5 points more than a Demolisher tank, which I think is a very reasonable pick, for that extra 5 points you get a tank order and the ability to shoot in death. I feel like that's very reasonable to trade out the Demolishers shooting combat type things for that. Finally, for the big tanks in the army, the Baneblade variants have gone down for a few of them, though not all. I feel like the standard Baneblade might be one of the single best winners out of that. That's gone down from a massive 540 to just 480. I thought it was kind of okay already between the Demolisher cannon and the main Baneblade cannon's output. Still going to have some issues of a bit less synergy and issues moving around terrain potentially, but I guess good to see at least a fair few of them keeping up with the other battle tank variants. Otherwise there's also slightly smaller drops for the Bane Hammer, Bane Sword, Hellhammer and Storm Sword, none quite as big as the Baneblades one though. It isn't all just purely good news for Imperial Guard forces though. The artillery in general has been nerfed a bit. One big one that I missed in the previous video on the balanced data slate in general was the Manticore. That one went up from 125 to 150 points. Really quite a meaty nerf, that one, to arguably one of the Guard's very best units right now. Seems that if you want so general purpose damage output with damage 3 and fairly high strength, you're now going to have to pay a big premium for it. Otherwise, the Forge World artillery got absolutely smashed. The Earthshaker carriage is 120 up from 80, and the Medusa carriage is 110 up from 80 as well. I feel like that puts both of those just not really competing very well against the standard Basilisk whatsoever. Seems like after all these nerfs, the standard Basilisk is probably the best artillery piece that the Guard has left. Otherwise, for more direct fire gun pieces, the Rapier laser destroyers from Forge World went up from 30 to 35. A fairly biggish nerf to something that was fairly good anti-tank before. Now I feel like their job's probably going to be done better by tanks that are a little bit tougher than the Rapiers, and the Tarantula batteries went up from 35 to 40, though I thought they were a lot worse than many other choices. Basically not amazing for artillery. Basilisks still seem fairly good though. I think Manticores are still usable, but definitely not an auto-include anymore. For other Guard vehicles, at least percentage-wise, the Scout Sentinel was one of the hardest hit units in the Codex. That's gone up from 50 points to 60, so a big 20% increase there. Though to be honest, I feel like if there's ever an acceptable nerf, then that one's probably kind of okay. They were just perhaps a bit surprisingly efficient at 50 points for their sheer defense, plus having a good combination of reasonably fast movement, not the worst damage output with hunter-killer missiles and chainsaws, and also the ability to recycle an entire squad of them for 2 CP. I still think they're very good at 60 points, and they're maybe a little bit more balanced against the Armoured Sentinel, which I wouldn't have rated quite as strong with them per point before. The Chimera has had one of the best decreases in the Codex though, That's down all the way to 70 points from 85. Very, very good value for a transport for what it does now, I think. Its durability is pretty great for just 70 points. It does have a fairly meaningful amount of firepower for killing enemy troops between multiple heavy bolters or multi-lasers and things, plus the lasgun defense arrays. I think you could genuinely play some fairly mech heavy guard with a whole bunch of Kazakin jumping out of these, or even just have a couple of chaff squads of infantry being moved towards the midfield objectives and chimeras to keep them safe while doing so. Finally, for flyers, the Valkyrie went down from 200 to 190, though I think it needed to decrease far more than that to get good. And for no clear reason, the Thunderbolt Heavy Fighter from Forge World went up to 200. Not sure of the thinking of that, as it was bad before. Then finally, there's a fair few changes to characters. For the generic characters, there wasn't really that much. The Commissar went down to 30 points and the Cadian Castellan to 45. I think they're both okay. The Commissar's maybe one that you kind of need to have multiple infantry squads to support though, so it sort of depends on whether you've got that. Otherwise though, a couple of the named characters went down really quite a lot to the extent they're very interesting. Gaunt's Ghost, I'm kind of surprised to see decrease this much. They went to 100 points from 115, and they were a tournament guard staple before that with their lone operative shenanigans. Just having fairly tanky units of lone operatives is very handy in general for wandering around scoring objectives, even if they don't do crazy amounts of damage. And I expect to see these played even more than they were before. The other biggest winner out of the index points changes is Iron Hand Strachan, who I'm not really too sure why, but he went down to just 55 points from 80, so an absolutely enormous drop there, and I did think he was actually pretty good at 80 for some surprising melee power plus orders and squad buffs. At 55 points and 55 points for the Kaschans, I think that 110 points for him in a unit seems very good. I think the overall value is pretty high there for skirmishing with enemy infantry on objectives. Otherwise, Sergeant Harker got an enormous points decrease, down to 40 points with his hidden heavy bolter in the unit, though I'd probably still have Strachan as my first pick for a Kaschan leader out of the two. Sly Marbo himself is down to 65, again another very handy lone operative there, and Nort Deadog is down to 60 from 70, though I'm not sure that's quite at the level where he's worth taking over the regular Ogrin one if you wanted one. Lord Solar and Ursula Creed are unchanged. I feel like they're both going to be staples, particularly Mr. Leontus with his command point farming. Overall, I'd say that it's broadly a very positive update for the Guard though. Really nice to see the battle tanks have a meaningful points decrease. I think it's really quite good for internal balance of the Guard Codex to have the tanks good again. Might incentivize a bit more of a well-rounded list with both infantry, tank and artillery elements. Otherwise, Chimeras with Kazakin in look like a really interesting option. Just 170 points for a transport full of special weapons. Gaunt's Ghosts are really annoying disruptive units to put in the midfield, and plenty of good choices remain like Basilisk and Lord Solar Leontus. I'd still very much like to play both flavours of Sentinels. Otherwise, for biggest losers, I feel like it's pretty much unquestionably the Forge World artillery pieces, really quite common sights in some of the more optimised lists out there. Now they're really not going to be. Manticores, I think, will also become a fair bit more scarce at 150 points. And I feel like you could argue everything that just wasn't all that great before and didn't get any help to be a bit of a loser as well. Valkyries, perhaps field ordnance batteries, and the Death Strike missile launcher might be some of the most obvious. Overall, 40k is in a bit of a state of flux at the moment, with just about everything being turned on its head. I feel like Guard in general are going to be heading a bit more towards the midfield with these sort of updates though. I think it's fairly safe to say that from their starting position they're probably not going to get to become one of 40k's top armies with these changes. They just don't seem to be standout enough to flip them from being a weaker faction to being one of the best. At least having a shot against the top factions would be really quite nice though. That'd be a nice change from where they were before the Dataslate. Let me know your thoughts though. Which Guard units are you most looking forward to using in new army lists since these updates have happened? I'm certainly interested to put some more tanks back on the table myself. I feel like there's a whole load of units that have just got a bit more of a feel-good factor now. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.